Welcome back to another episode of Missdiagnosed. I'm your host, Caitlin Pyle, and today we're talking about how our brains are static. It's chapter 2 in Brain Saver by Anthony William, the medical medium. He's been around for 30 years. He has a very supernatural origin story. He has never been to medical school, yet somehow, some way, he's able to help doctors solve mystery medical problems with their patients when they can't solve it themselves. It's just absolutely incredible. If you haven't picked up a copy of the original book, Medical Medium, it's a whole lot smaller than this one, which is over 600 pages, and it gives you a very good overview. It's still very thorough, but it's a good overview of chronic and mystery illness and a great entry point for people who have literally tried everything, who are perhaps suffering from mental illness symptoms, right? Because that's what they are. They are symptoms. They are not the problem itself. And that's what is crazy about this industry that purports to be helping us, right? They're attacking symptoms. And because your symptoms are suppressed, they're saying you're getting treatment. It's so gross. You go to any website, I always use bipolar as an example. So if you just Google bipolar disorder, right? We get in-network psychiatric care, talkhiatry.com. We do it a licensed clinical social worker from betterhelp.com, specializing in bipolar disorder. Online bipolar diagnosis, Mayo Clinic ad, bipolar disorder explained. And we get all this information that comes up. Bipolar disorder, also called manic depression, a disorder associated with episodes of mood swings ranging from depressive lows to manic highs. The exact cause of bipolar disorder isn't known. Actually, it is, but we'll never hear about it from the public-facing medical industry because it would absolutely destroy the pharmaceutical industry. And that's the case for every disorder that's in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. We will never be told what the true cause is, and the true cause will never be discussed in these textbooks that they have because it would not absolve, right? Because there is no need, save for in emergency acute situations like, someone's having a seizure, right? Which may not necessarily be a mental illness symptom, but something much more severe. Antipsychotics in the acute situation can be extremely helpful, but antipsychotics for life as a quote-unquote treatment, that's honestly should be considered a crime. It really should. So they say that the exact cause of bipolar disorder isn't known, but a combination of genetics, environment, and altered brain structure and chemistry may play a role. But what's causing, if it is genetics, right, which medical medium says it plays a very small role, but if it is genetics, and we know that genes expression can be turned on and off, what's causing genes to be turned on and off? What in the environment is causing the symptoms? What is happening to the brain and how? What's happening to the brain structure and chemistry and how that is possibly, according to these people, playing a role in causing this thing that we have named bipolar disorder. They say it's very common, more than 3 million cases per year. So it's very common, and you'd think there would be more research into the root causes, but they're not interested in finding the root causes because then they won't need drugs, right? Once we know the organic cause of these mental illness symptoms, right, which this book discloses in great detail, what the medical industry believes is a need for pharmaceutical drugs to correct these chemical imbalances just completely goes out the window because you can't fix an organic problem with inorganic substances. It doesn't make any sense. You're never going to have a healed brain if you put in substances that are unnatural. And that's exactly what happens. Treatment is, go get therapy and take these pills to make you feel okay about taking the pills and making sure you're continuing to take the pills. It's just brainwashing that you pay for with your life, essentially, because as we've discussed on the show before, these substances are what create the chemical imbalance permanently. Become dependent on it. The chemical imbalances are happening for organic causes. That's why you experience symptoms, but they're not getting to the root cause of the symptoms. and they're not equipping people with the knowledge and the motivation, helping them feel in control. Like, hey, your brain is an organ, and because of certain things in your environment, X, Y, and Z, pesticides, gluten that's been treated with glyphosate, oats that have been treated with glyphosate, fertilizers in your yard, mold in your house. These things are causing the metals to move around in your brain. Everybody has metals in your brain. Nobody ever gets that explanation. It's gross. It's just gross that the first line of attack is to just talk about it and take some pills and get people used to their new life as someone with mental illness and getting them to adjust to the belief and feeling like they need to accept that that's where they're at in life. And I would not accept that. I was great for the first at least 25 years of my life before I started experiencing any type of anxiety to the point where I would get stomach aches and have to, force myself to burp constantly because it hurts so bad. And there was only way I could get that painful gas out of my stomach. And I thought it was just, it's anxiety, blah, blah, blah. Like, yeah, the gas was causing me anxiety because it hurt so much. But why was the gas forming? And it was because of what I was eating and consuming in my environment. And I wouldn't ever give that a second thought. But it makes so much sense. Like, if you have a crop, right, wheat, and it's not only been genetically modified, it's also sprayed with pesticides for the entirety of its life, specifically Roundup. And then that wheat is processed. The Roundup doesn't go anywhere. And not to mention that it's genetically modified, so it probably has Roundup in it, like just in general, to be resistant to the pests by its very being and to grow faster or whatever. So your body doesn't recognize it as food, and it also comes with a pesticide in it. So it's not the gluten itself that's bad, it's all the stuff that's been done to it. And that's why people are experiencing celiac disease and gluten sensitivity. It's not the gluten itself. It's the toxins and poisons that it becomes in the process of getting to our sandwiches and our pizza. It's just full of toxins and poisons. And then if we have any kind of viral load in our guts and our systems in general, those viruses are going to eat that food, and our liver is going to attempt to protect us from that poison that we've ingested, because that's how it sees it, is poison, and we have to protect the body, we have to protect the brain from this poison. Then gas comes from that. Neurotoxins, dermatoxins come from that. So people start experiencing really bad stomach issues. They start experiencing anxiety. They start experiencing skin issues, things that have been labeled autoimmune because it appears the body is attacking itself, and it's not attacking itself. There's a pathogen involved that somehow just slips under the radar. Well, number one, there's not ways to check for it. There's not ways to check for viruses inside your thyroid or in your liver and in your bones. There's no practical way like the blood to really check for things like that, especially in the brain. Like, what are you going to do? Open the brain, like take a biopsy? That's just not possible. So you can't see that there's heavy metals in the brain, but you know that there is. You can't see inflammation on MRIs either. Other than the cyst in the middle of my brain around my pineal gland, the MRI did not show any inflammation despite my brain being inflamed. And we're actually going to be talking about that today. We're going to be talking about brain injury a little bit. And yeah, so let's circle it back. Chapter 2 it's called Your Static Brain. And he opens it and saying that when we talk about the brain, most of the time we just call it the brain. We see it as this round, singular organ, is what he calls it. And we've largely been disconnected from our brain. The way we refer to our brains as the head, right? When we're dealing with physical problems or emotional problems, and somebody has mental illness, we get told, you're sick in the head, right? And there's such a stigma attached around it. And that results in us being really disconnected from our brains. But our brains are not just a single isolated lump of gray matter. And there's actually a much better way to view our brains, and that is as a group of neurons, because that's exactly what our brain is. It's an extremely complex, intelligent organ that contains billions, with a B, billions of neurons. And we aren't taught to be in touch with our neurons or our central nervous system, which is what our neurons control, is our central nervous system, which controls the entire body. And that was something that when I read Dr. Daniel Amen's book, The End of Mental Illness, in January of this year, which really set me on the path to realizing, wow, brain health is something. Like, this is not just a personality problem that I've been told, bipolar disorder or manic depression or ADHD or whatever. Like, these are not just like a difference in personality and something that, is laying dormant in my system for however many years and now I'm dealing with it. Like, this has everything to do with the health of my brain. And if my brain's not healthy, then these symptoms can happen. And I knew that having had my brain scanned in March of 2021, but in learning about the function of neurons and how they affect our ability to understand, comprehend information, listen, perceive, think, all of that is affected by the health of our neurons. And so it makes a lot of sense that when I first received or was given the information about the fact that I had traumatic brain injury and was prescribed infrared sauna, was prescribed hyperbaric oxygen therapy, all of these different supplements to take in an effort to get my brain healthier. Ironically, also with Adderall, but nobody's perfect. It did get me out of the woods, finally getting on Adderall in July of last year. And I don't take it anymore. I don't need it anymore. My brain has gotten to a point where I don't need that boost of adrenaline through my system to get me going. But that's how bad it had gotten. And I hadn't always needed it, right? So there was evidence. If you didn't always need something, then it wasn't a lifelong condition. It wasn't something that you've always had. Now, some people do say, I've had symptoms my whole life, or I have had ADHD since I was a kid. And as we'll learn, the more we go through this book together, heavy metals that are in the brain and the lifestyles that our parents have, all of that stuff becomes part of us when we're born. We are conceived very organically, all of us, right? I don't think any of us that I know of were conceived or created in a pure vacuum environment inside a test tube, right? Which, how pure is that? Not pure at all. And our parents did the best they could. They had their lifestyles, their parents had lifestyles, their parents had lifestyles. All that stuff is passed down. And as we learned in the last episode, mercury was an elixir, a medical treatment for many, many years, centuries even. It was given to people. And I'm sure one day we'll do an episode just on the history of mercury because it's fascinating. It used to be known that it would make people crazy after they took it, and it would take a while for people to stop being crazy after getting their mercury treatment. So why did they do it for so long? I don't know, but it fascinates me, and we'll look into it at some point. But I had no idea that brain health affected your entire body because there's so little that we learn about the brain, and it really should be a crime. I say this, I feel like I say this a lot, or at least I think it a lot if I don't say it a lot. It should be a crime how little we are taught about the actual function and purpose of our brain. Like, our body exists to protect the brain. Our consciousness and our souls actually live inside the brain. We don't get too much into like mystical stuff, spiritual stuff on this podcast, but the truth is everything is spiritual, and your brain is a spiritual organ. I didn't know that either. I felt like my soul had died, and Anthony Williams says that it's a supernatural, it's a very supernatural organ. So when your brain is under siege, as mine was, your soul actually leaves to protect itself because it's got a physical essence to it. No science at this time exists to be able to detect that, obviously, although they're saying that after death they can measure the weight of the brain and it's less. And of course there's lots of accounts for near-death experiences and people being able to see themselves on the operating table, things like that. But science is so far behind that it's unlikely that they'll ever recognize that the soul exists. But it does, and it leaves the brain when there's mental illness happening, in part or in whole. That's why it can feel like I'm dead inside, and that's exactly the way I felt. I felt like I was absolutely dead inside, that I had no soul, and my brain, what was left of it, was trying to function just without that half of it, and it was not living. It was just existing, and it was terrible. And I hope that you guys listening to this are receiving this information in a way that makes you think, oh, brain health should be our number one goal, because it really should be. And I'm not trying to preach to you. I'm trying to encourage you and support you and empower you with information that you can use to make better decisions so you can have a better life. And it's actually quite simple. It's really a case of what you don't know can absolutely hurt you. So if we were taught that we can be in touch with our neurons and our central nervous system, we would understand that many challenges with our health are actually about our neurons that are having problems. And they can have problems because of deficiencies in nutrients and other really critical supplies. They can be contaminated by heavy metals, toxic heavy metals. There's a bunch of other contaminants too There could be viral toxins and poisons, as was my case, right? I had the Epstein-Barr virus and I had mycoplasma pneumonia, which I'll never know exactly where that was. But bacteria is often a cofactor with viral growth because the virus lowers the immune system and allows other things to grow with it. So you'll often see Epstein-Barr virus with types of bacteria. And I really consider myself somewhat lucky, very lucky that I had a doctor who was just like, yeah, let's order the test for virus infections. And that got me on the path to uncovering this stuff. So neuron damage can be caused by electrical heat and intense adrenaline that results as after fight or flight or emotional injuries, which I can remember feeling intense heat like in the center of my head when I was going through after my divorce. And I would think that it was something spiritual, because I was in this like weird otherworldly place a lot of the time in this, I guess, psychosis / mania. I mean, I was smoking a lot of pot too, so it was most likely psychosis. There's a whole section of the book that talks about psychosis and how cannabis can cause it. It's really interesting. We'll get there. We're on page 10 right now. So in the book, we're not going page by page. We are going chapter by chapter. And that was following a major period of flight. Like I wasn't fighting. I was flighting. I had moved to Arizona. I had been there for like 3 weeks. I was like, Florida is toxic. Like I was just running away from my problems. And that was intense fight or flight mode that I was in as a result of emotional injury and what had happened after my first admission to the hospital, which if you haven't heard about that, it's in the first couple of episodes of this podcast in season 1. I don't know. People do the best they can. And I've done a lot of inner work to come to terms with the fact that when people react to you in certain ways, they are doing the best they can with what they have. So nobody's wrong. They just have a completely different experience. And if we were them, we would be having the exact same experience. So yeah, neurons, back to what we're talking about here. Neurons have everything to do with why someone seeks help from a mental health practitioner. And when someone sees a therapist or psychiatrist for emotional or mental support, neurons are actually the last thing that those professionals think about. The psychiatrist that saw me in the clinical setting, nobody was talking about my neurons, even though I was begging them at one point to scan my brain. Nobody cared. Not that neurons would even come up on a brain scan, but I didn't know how elementary and rudimentary and simple testing was. Yeah, all that to say, brain is somewhat of a mystery word. It doesn't help us get close to the problems that are within our brain, and it keeps us from looking deeper inside to uncover those problems. And when I talk about brain injury, there's actually brain injury that can be caused by emotional and mental abuse or trauma or hardship that affects us emotionally, as was my case. Because I never hit my head really hard. I didn't have what would be considered a concussion or a standard way for your brain to become injured that most people are aware of and what's what they think of when you hear the words brain injury or traumatic brain injury. But there's many other ways that your brain can be injured. And neuroscience as a field is only just starting to acknowledge that this can happen on a very elementary level. But even if all types of brain injury could be understood, we would still see a tendency to keep a distance from what's really happening inside the brain because we just don't feel a need to go there. And often, well, in my opinion, from firsthand experience, psychiatrists don't feel a need to go there. A lot of psychiatrists are like symptom, check down their list that they get out of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and they say, you have bipolar disorder because you're talking fast, you have been in the hospital before, and people say you're acting weird. You're crying because you say, I'm not understanding you. So it's bipolar disorder. It's really ridiculous. And then they just put you on a drug, and that's it. And they tell you have to take this drug because you have this disorder. I've still got the page up on when I Googled bipolar disorder. It says, treatment can help, but this condition can't be cured. It says it's chronic, can last for years or be lifelong. It requires a medical diagnosis, and lab tests or imaging are not required. This is just, I can't even believe it, because it's not that it's not required, it's because lab tests and imaging don't exist to prove its existence. There's nothing that they can do to prove that it exists. All they're looking at is symptoms, and those symptoms are caused by something. It just blows my mind. Anthony says there's a classified goal. That's the words he used. A classified goal to keep us disconnected from our brain or what's within our brain. We're in a time in history where we are brainwashed like we've never been brainwashed before. The industries, and we've talked about the industry. I mean, this whole podcast started because of the medical science industry and the mental health industrial complex wanting to protect itself before it protects people. The industries want us to be disconnected from the reality of what's happening inside our brains. Knowing more than, oh, we're just having a problem in here in our heads, knowing more than that would mean that we're getting closer to the truth of all the wrongdoing that's happening within the industries. Not just in the medical world, but in other industries, like the pharmaceutical company, which I guess is part of the medical industrial complex. But we know that pharmaceutical companies own the pesticide companies. Bayer owns Monsanto that sprays all of our food and makes these genetically modified seeds. All these things that are causing the illness, they're all interconnected. The food industry, all of them are connected. It's so disgusting. There's a difference between the public-facing medical industry and the classified medical industries. The classified medical industry is a covert medical entity that our doctors and medical communities that we're familiar with aren't actually privy to. So that classified medical industry has a vested interest in keeping experts in the publicly known medical industry, which is what we all know about, in the dark. Just like it's best to keep people like I was suffering from brain issues completely in the dark because it keeps us at a distance from what's really happening and why. Knowing that our condition or symptom is that it is brain related to begin with and understanding how that relates to all of our nervous system, these are the missing pieces for many of us in how we think about our health. So what exactly are neurons? Now we're really getting into it. Neurons have everything to do with why someone's seeking help, but most people don't know that. They can be deficient in all kinds of things. They can be contaminated. They can be damaged. But what neurons are, it's a type of nerve tissue. They're how communication occurs in our nervous system, which allows our nervous system and our brain to send and receive messages, input and output. They are transcribers. So Anthony has a great picture for us. He says, imagine billions of tiny people inside your brain sitting at a desk in front of a computer, translating information that's coming in through all of your senses. So smell, taste, touch, hearing, trying to decipher it. And I have high frequency hearing loss. Like there is a very real chance that some of my neurons have been damaged because of the virus and the brain injury because I didn't start having this crazy tinnitus this bad. And I don't even know if you can even call it tinnitus. It's neural noise. Until after the dust had settled from my first couple of hospitalizations. And so the neuron transcriber's job is to make sense out of what we're experiencing and then pass the information to the next tiny neuron person inside the brain. And the hope is that all that information gets uninterruptedly traveled, like it goes to the next transcriber, and then the next transcriber takes the information, keeps it in a very purified form, it doesn't get interrupted, adds something that's efficient and accurate, prepares it for the next neuron. Neurons apply to every single function that your body has, and how healthy the neurons are is going to determine how comfortable you're going to be in your mind and your body. Your state of health, your mental functioning, neurons are involved in all of it. And when you have brain-related symptoms, even on the mild scale, like maybe you're experiencing mild fatigue or mild brain fog, it's really because neurons aren't able to transfer information properly to the next group. Something's hindering the pathway. Something's blocking or impeding the pathway within the neuron synapses, like the entry points. So the neurons sending out those impulses aren't reaching other neurons that need the information or not reaching them the way that they're intended. Any kind of blockage or impediment within a network of neurons in someone's brain can mean that the information the neurons are processing gets altered, and that affects our ability to focus, listen, or properly receive information from a conversation or a story. Damaged neurons can change thoughts, perceptions, and our overall experience of reality. That is just absolutely mind-blowing to me that I didn't know this before. It just really hits home. The way I was thinking about myself, the way I was perceiving the world, the people around me, myself, all of it had to do with my neurons being damaged. I couldn't focus, couldn't listen, had a really hard time comprehending. Obviously, the hearing loss had something to do with that, but is it caused by neuron damage? I don't know. I don't know. It has something to do with it because not being able to perceive or receive all of the frequencies had certainly had something to do with it. And people don't really understand either, I certainly didn't, what a thought is. It's not just something that lives inside our neurons and glial cells in the brain. A thought can actually travel, and it travels within the electricity that leaves a neuron. Kind of a long story short, our brains are not just a lump of gray matter. And it's not just a bunch of fat, right? We're being told that our brains are made out of fat mostly. And I think that's because they're autopsying old brains that are, cadaver brains that are oftentimes very sick. And they're saying, oh, brains are mostly made of this, but you can't look at a healthy brain and autopsy it and find out all the time, get enough data to recognize that, hey, not all brains look like this. Everybody's brain is different. It really is. It's fascinating. And all of this explains why we all experience the same event so differently. Damaged neurons lead to disorganized information because the electricity within our brains becomes disorganized. And the reason why this chapter is called static is because the electricity that comes from damaged or contaminated neurons, that's what it carries, is static. Think about all of those neurons as tiny little transcriber people in your brain, and they're sitting there with headphones and they're trying to hear through all that static and type out the message correctly to pass it along. And what they're getting in the static are fragments of information. And I always describe my hearing loss as like hearing with like an Andy Warhol painting. You know what an Andy Warhol painting looks like. It's missing a whole bunch of colors, but you can still kind of tell what it is, but not the fullness of it. And they call that art, but when you hear an Andy Warhol painting, it is very frustrating, and it can be a cause for a lot of people, as in my case, of anxiety, social disconnect, like just withdrawal completely, depression, and overall irritability, because people's voices were very annoying because my brain couldn't put all the pieces together. So that's what's happening. Healthy neurons have to compensate for damaged neurons that are releasing the skewed staticky information into the electricity. And when the neurons get damaged and contaminated more and more over time, that compensating backup power isn't enough anymore. And so we end up with not as many neurons that are healthy to do the work of all that reorganization and interpreting information. That's when symptoms appear. So we have symptoms like focus and concentration issues, anxiety, memory loss, depression, a lot of emotional struggles, and that's just a few things. Those things will start to surface. And then we also will see physical conditions like weakness in our limbs, body pain, migraines, which I know what that's like, vision issues, neuron damage, and contamination can affect even our most basic level of communication, Anthony says. And that makes it a struggle, not just to process information, but also to verbally pass along that information. So repeating information that we've heard. And that's something that I'm working on. That's why it's so important to me to get my brain fixed, is because I want to be able to do this podcast with my most effective communication skills, and I want to continue getting better. And that's a big reason why I'm concentrating so hard on getting my brain to be as healthy as possible. So neurons mean everything, and how we treat our neurons should be everyone's primary concern. And there's a lot of people out there that sell products with ingredients that are not helpful to the brain, but on the labels they'll put on there oh, it's for toxic heavy metals or for brain health or memory health. And it's just marketing. It takes advantage of people's newfound awareness that oftentimes stems from medical mediums information. People don't realize that either. People just market medical mediums information and sell products, but the products themselves are really guessing games and theories so that they can make money. Be aware of that. So neurons can be damaged by toxic heavy metals, caffeine, solvents, cleaning products, fragrances, perfumes, colognes, air fresheners, scented candles, MSG. I'm looking at you, Doritos. DDT, that's a pesticide. Petrochemicals, radiation, and plastic, to name a few. You think about how hard people try. I know how hard I try to just fix myself, trying to go to therapy and talk therapy, and they say, oh, it'll take a long time to come to acceptance and all this stuff. But there's so many courses and classes out there and programs you can apply yourself to try to fix your so-called mental illness symptoms, and people blame themselves, like I certainly did. And we put a lot of energy into trying to correct our minds, which is actually our brains, by doing everything we can to make ourselves better people on a spiritual, emotional, and mental level. But oftentimes that stuff doesn't work and we fall back into old patterns because the real reason why we're struggling with these symptoms is never discovered. We'll look at brain fog as an example that Anthony gives in the book. It says brain fog. We don't think of it as a physical symptom. I'm paraphrasing here. So we might feel like our inability to focus is our fault and that it's some kind of mental shortcoming for us and that we can overcome it if we just apply ourselves, right? But the reality is that brain fog is a physical symptom that results from our neurons being impeded. So if we address those physical factors that cause the brain fog in the first place, then we can relieve or solve that brain fog and find our way through again. And we don't have to battle or interrogate ourselves with being inadequate. And we were never inadequate to begin with. We were up against physical challenges that we didn't even know were there and our doctors didn't look for. So we get set up for failure because the people we think of as experts don't even know our neurons are hindered, that they are contaminated with toxic substances. They don't know what this stuff does to the electricity and information that's traveling through our brains and our nervous systems through that neuron system, and they don't know what to do about it. And that sucks. It really sucks. That about wraps it up for the Your Static Brain chapter. I thought we were going to have to do 2 episodes on this, but it's actually chapter 3, Your Alloy Brain, that we're going to most likely do 2 parts of because it's such a long chapter and there's so much interesting information in there. As the first 2 chapters done already, and we're going to be learning just what is contaminating, injuring, impeding, depriving, burning out, damaging, and limiting our neurons, that brain tissue, those little messengers that translate and pass on information within our brains. What is inflaming and scarring and atrophying our brains, and how is threatening our well-being, and how all that stuff is influencing how we experience the world, how we struggle. Ultimately, what I want you guys to take away from this episode, this whole podcast really, is that it's not you. You are not weak. You are not faulty. You didn't cause this. You didn't create or manifest these symptoms. You aren't sick in the head in that way that you may have been told. You're not cuckoo. You were lost and you were stranded and you're not anymore, and it's not your fault. There's an interest out there, the classified medical industry, that industrial complex, that even the public facing, people who write all the information online about how bipolar disorder isn't curable, as an example. All of that information, that public facing information, they get their information from the classified medical industry, and they have an agenda that doesn't serve you. It serves themselves. The industry will protect itself before it will protect you, always. It's all about money, and there's no money in curing your bipolar disorder. There's no money in curing your chronic anxiety. There's no money in getting you out of depression or figuring out why you're feeling brain fog. There's no money in coming up with lab tests or imaging to uncover these things. There is money in convincing you that it's lifelong. There is money in convincing you that it can't be cured. There is money in convincing you, brainwashing you into believing that you have to sit in therapy and take drugs for the rest of your life. You become part of the machine. It's recurring revenue for them. And that means that a lot of this information that we see, whether it looks like it or not, is marketing. That wraps it up. That was Your Static Brain, Chapter 2 of Medical Medium's Brain Saver. Thank you for tuning in. I appreciate you, and I hope you found this information helpful and interesting. Do reach out to me if you have any questions. My email address is in the show notes, as are resources that I mention, books that I mention. I'll put links to those in the show notes so you can get to those. Be well, be safe, take care of your brain, and we'll see you in the next episode. Thank you so much for tuning in to Missdiagnosed. If this show has helped you in any way, please consider leaving a 5-star review on iTunes. Sharing your experience will help others who are lost in the darkness find their own way out of the science of lies. Please note that while I may go in depth into medical topics and have acquired substantial medical knowledge, I am not a medical doctor. I'm a researcher. I'm a messenger of hope for other survivors of industrialized psychiatry. Because of how toxic psychiatric drugs are, it can be extremely dangerous, even life-threatening, to suddenly stop taking certain drugs. This is especially true for antidepressants, antipsychotics, and benzodiazepines. The longer you've taken the drug, the more dangerous withdrawal can be. If you want to heal your brain and soul naturally, the way it was designed to do, please seek the help of a compassionate and patient-centered physician to start the process of withdrawing from them as safely as possible. It will take time for your brain to reacclimate to life without the drugs, and there are doctors out there who will support you in your quest to save your brain. Never give up. You can heal.